marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so excited to be hosting today, and especially about the two guests that I have. One of them in the first hour is Tim Goeglein. He's written a new book called Stumbling Toward Utopia. It really takes us back to the 60s and how many of the problems that we've got in the country today start from attempts in those years and even earlier to try to achieve some sort of utopia in America, a la Marxism. And so he's going to join me to talk about this book. We're going to really dig into it for the first hour. And also, Mike Farris is going to join me. He is working for the National Religious Broadcasters. He's been around a long time and been just a wonderful participant on Point of View programming in many of his capacities. But the one that we're going to address today is the one where he's counsel for the National Religious Broadcasters Association. He is actually suing on behalf of them to try to strike down the Johnson Amendment, which is the amendment that was also put in place in the 70s. And it really stymies and muzzles pastors and nonprofit organizations from giving all the information about candidates and to voters. And so, it's something that shouldn't be there. Pastors are actually, sometimes they self-censor in talking about politics and elections. And so NRB is concerned about that, and I'm really glad for what they're doing. So that'll be later in the second hour. But right now, I'm so happy to be able to introduce my guest. He's Tim Goeglein, and he's the Vice President for External and Government Relations at Focus on the Family. He's based in Washington, D.C., and for decades, he served in high-level government posts. He worked as special assistant to President George W. Bush, and he was deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison from 2001 to 2008. And that's how I know Tim, because he was the president's principal outreach contact for conservatives and faith-based groups. And I got to participate in a call with him every week where we got lots of great information and things that we could pass on to those listening to us. And so I got to know him that way, and I've known him ever since. And he's also, he worked before that for Senator Dan Coates. He was press secretary, deputy press secretary, and press secretary there. And he's written several books, including the one that I'm going to talk about with him today, Stumbling Toward Utopia: How the 1960s Turned into a National Nightmare and How We Can Revive the American Dream. Tim, thank you so much for joining me.
Penna, it is truly great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, those were fun days when you were in the White House, and we got to hear what was on the heart of President Bush. Many things pleased those of us who are Christians and conservatives. He was, he was actually a great president in that sense. And sometimes I also miss just what a family man he was, and sort of an upstanding citizen that you could be proud as your president. I know a lot of people are critical, but I really loved that time.
I did too, and I wrote a whole book about it, as you know, called Man in the Middle. It was my first book. And the reason I wrote that book, Penna, is the thing you're alluding to, which is when you read Man in the Middle, overwhelmingly, it's not a political book. It was meant to be a memoir, a series of snapshots of what it is like to be a Christian working at close hand with a United States president. And I think that those years were so unique. In fact, I would even suggest that the political years since the Bush years have been really, I think, very dramatic.
You think so?
I think it's, I actually am trying to be understated. But I think that the years between 2000 and 2008, the Bush presidency, I think quite unfortunately, Penna, sort of gets swallowed up in history, or it gets overshadowed by the war. But there was a lot going on, and there were monumental things going on. And of course, you and I worked on them. And I think the most profound one of which was the fundamental reshaping of the federal judiciary. I think it's fair to say that if you are a fellow conservative and you are more often than not pleased for once with what's happening in the district and the appellate and the Supreme Court decisions, not on everything, but on many things, we really have George W. Bush to thank. He did a fabulous job in paying attention and making the Constitution the center of it.
Yes, he did. And a lot of that was undoing damage that is described in the book that you wrote, Stumbling Toward Utopia, Tim. And I think if people want to know what's wrong with our society today, they could very easily pick up this book and read it. And it's not long. It's only 180 pages. But it really brings you through what has happened since the 1960s and even before, what the progressives did, how they tried to get I guess you would call it a utopia. And in doing so, Tim, they really messed a lot of things up, didn't they?
They really did. And in fact, I'm glad, my friend, that you used that phrase, messing it up, because that was the common phrase that I heard in the 3 years before I wrote Stumbling Toward Utopia. Because as one of the vice presidents that focus on the family, even though I live and work here in Washington, D.C., I travel extensively, about a third of the time. And whether I was in front of a left-wing audience, right-wing, or non-ideological, I'm not a betting man, Penna, but within the first 2, 3, 4 questions, someone would say something like, how in the world did we get into this mess? And having heard this recurring question, I was intrigued. And I was coming back from a speaking date in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I asked one of the stewards on the airplane to hand me a sheaf of those tiny little, they may be the smallest napkins in world history, Penna, on airplanes. Yeah. And he gave me a stack of napkins, and I began to outline the answer to how do we get into this mess. And the short answer is the moral and the social revolution of the 1960s, and what the radicalism of that period in law and legal spaces, in politics, in education, in popular entertainment, all of these things in Stumbling Toward Utopia answer the question, how do we get into this mess? And I'm very eager for my fellow Christians and conservatives to read Stumbling Toward Utopia and to learn about this incredible moral revolution that was imposed upon our country. And I think most people who were living through it at the time had no idea what was being planned for our remarkable country.
No, I don't think they didn't. And I do hope. I'm very hopeful. I read the book from cover to cover because I resonated with it. I actually lived through it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll stick with us for the full first hour of Point of View as Tim Goeglein takes us through the things that happened. And, of course, we won't be able to cover them all. But I think you may get a taste for this book and want to get a copy. So stick with us. We've got more of Point of View after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, it is estimated that Charles Wesley wrote over 6,500 hymns. Perhaps his best-known hymn is Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Over the years, it has been edited slightly, but the meaning and theology remains as he wrote it more than 2 centuries ago. It begins with a proclamation of the birth of Jesus. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. The hymn reminds us why Christ came to earth. Jesus came into the world to bring peace, but many who sing this song fail to realize that it was to bring peace between us and God. Wesley's hymn reminds us that his birth was so that God and sinners could be reconciled. We are the sinners in this hymn, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have broken God's commandments and need to be reconciled with God. This was done when Christ died for our sins. This hymn by Charles Wesley goes on to describe who Jesus Christ is. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time behold him come, offspring of the Virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. This is the wonder of the incarnation. Jesus became the offspring of the Virgin's womb. God became man and was veiled in flesh, even though he was the incarnate deity. This Christmas week, let us all once again reflect upon the incarnation, how wonderful yet mysterious that God would become man and dwell among us, and that he would be willing to die on a cross for our sins. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, as much as we would like to create a utopia, we won't be able to do that. Tim Goeglein is my guest. His book is Stumbling Toward Utopia. We know now that we didn't reach that, I guess, utopia that some people longed for. But there's an element that thinks man can perfect things, Tim, and it's an element that, tends to discard God and sort of trust man's efforts in doing things. You, and all of this that started back in the 60s started on the coast. I was actually in California at that time. I remember a bit of it. I was actually born in the 50s, so that dates me. But I remember my mom complaining about education, and I also remember the fact that we went to church, but the church turned left, and we ended up leaving because it wasn't really giving us any answers. You had a pen pal to whom the same thing happened, didn't you?
I did, and I write about that. He grew up in Northern California and is of the same generation as you, my friend. And he penned this series of observations that shows the incremental but decline in the area where he lived in the Bay Area of California, rooted completely in the moral and social revolution of the 1960s. And you are absolutely right. It began corrosively on the coasts and began to move inward. And what I show and demonstrate, Penna, in Stumbling Toward Utopia, is that the radicalism of the 1960s did not come from nowhere. It was planned really at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, by a handful of very influential, well-funded, powerful Americans. One of them was a U.S. president, Woodrow Wilson. He was very uncomfortable with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he said the country should be run by experts. He was very concerned about what he called citizen sovereignty. Can you imagine that? The founder of the ACLU plays another starring role in Stumbling Toward Utopia. This is Roger Baldwin. And a lot of our fellow conservatives do not know that the founder of the ACLU was a communist. He was very uncomfortable with faith and religion in the public square and wanted to fundamentally change our legal system. Another one was John Dewey. This is a name that should be on the tip of the tongue of every conservative who is concerned about what's happened in American education, because John Dewey, as you know, Penna, was very eager to shift American education from right and wrong, good and bad, objective standards of truth. The idea of science, math, reading, English. He wanted to use the schools to create a new kind of transformative global citizen. And he unfortunately succeeded in doing that in our public schools. Margaret Sanger, the founder of the sexual revolution, she was a eugenicist, the founder of Planned Parenthood, in fact. And this matrix of very bad ideas really gets jet fuel in the early part of the 20th century, Penna, and it did not take long that as the 50s and especially the 60s and 70s were coming into focus, the radical revolution that these people and a few others envisioned really fundamentally changed our nation.
It seems like it sort of percolated. All these Marxists were starting at the turn of the century, as you said, and then in the 20s. And then you had Woodrow Wilson, which I really didn't know his role until I read your book quite in depth. And you get these stories in the book. But then, in the 60s, you mentioned that the progressives wanted a faster takeover of the institutions. It already seemed like it was pretty fast. But so they pinpointed the universities, didn't they?
They did indeed. And in fact, something that is almost forgotten now is called the Port Huron Statement. And this statement should not be considered kind of old and dusty news. In fact, it's on the progressive left. It was really the ultimate catalyzing force of the 1960s, because as I demonstrate in Stumbling Toward Utopia, this document, which was written by Tom Hayden, your fellow Californian, later the husband of Jane Fonda, this was, Penna, ultimately the most important blueprint of the 1960s for the overtaking of American higher education. The Port Huron Statement's goal was to use the universities as a truncheon against the values of the overwhelming majority of the American people, and to use modern universities and eventually all other schools really in a kind of weaponization against our country. And people who went to the University of California, who went to Berkeley, who went to UCLA on the other side of the 1950s knew these as among the most important, excellent, areas of higher education in world history. And what had happened to them as a result of the 60s by the 70s and 80s was a complete radicalization. And of course, what we saw in our own nation, the anti-Semitism, the using of campuses for purely political reasons, was a direct result of what happened in the 1960s.
When you talk about the results, and you are talking about, what we're seeing today with anti-Semitism on campus, but also, I mean, right now, one of the focuses of this election has been the working class and the change in allegiance that you've seen. But when we saw what happened on the campus with kids, really upper middle class, getting into drugs, getting into sexual promiscuity, and just kind of losing the traditional values they'd been raised with. And I really lived through this. Fortunately, my dad didn't let me to go to any of those University of California schools that you mentioned, but I saw it. And the effects are not limited to just one generation, but I do see that the working class is hurt more by these moral changes, really, than anyone, don't you think?
I do. And in fact, I'm really pleased that you say that, because in Stumbling Toward Utopia, I was particularly curious about two big things. The first was what kind of the new elite morality would ultimately mean for everybody else. And the second thing, Penna, directly related to it, was the fundamental takeover of popular entertainment. I think we have to remember that Hollywood, and there's California again, but Hollywood was capable of making these extraordinary films. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Here we are in the season of It's a Wonderful Life, Miracle on 34th Street. I mean, these will be great films in 100 years.
I even think of all the early Disney movies. They were just spectacular.
They were spectacular, and they were high art. And the fact that Hollywood allowed itself to be overtaken by the 1960s, foisting the new morality on the middle and working classes, was part of what the radicals of the 60s intended to do.
Well, I think so. And they certainly succeeded in many ways. And, we can talk about the influence of a man named Norman Lear, who we used to kind of openly talk about his ideas and point of view because they were antithetical to ours.
I'm really glad you said that, because he also plays, as you know, Penna, a starring role in the book. Before the radicalization of the 60s, American sitcoms had gentle humor, and they are really great sitcoms. Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, I could go on and on. The Dick Van Dyke Show. These are wonderful comedies, and mostly they are free of what Norman Lear absorbed from the 1960s in changing the idea of American humor and the idea of American sitcoms in prime time, which is that he inhaled this enormous amount of skepticism and cynicism, and also used politics and weaved that into his humor. And so the next thing you know, you have series like Maude, which are actually sitcoms that celebrate abortion. You have, All in the Family, where we were all supposed to really revile Archie Bunker for every single thing, because, of course, he supported America during Vietnam, and he thought that there were rightful questions about the resignation of a U.S. president, and he was really made out to be, if I may say, kind of retrograde. And I think much of Lear's, not all.
I've got to jump in here, Tim.
Entertainment goals, you bet.
We've got a break, and yes, there's so many great points made in this book about certain phenomena in our culture and society and how they've affected us today. So we're going to continue that discussion with Tim Goeglein. Stick with us. We'll be more with Point of View.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Penna Dexter.
I'm so grateful to have Timothy Goeglein as my guest today on Point of View and for the book that he has written, Stumbling Toward Utopia. It really explains a lot of things, and I think you'll want to read it. As I mentioned, it's not even a long book, but it's packed with information and explanation for the way the culture is today. And Tim, we were talking about Norman Lear, and you tell stories of different players and people who were really progressive and they affected the country. And I think that that's a good way to help us to understand this. And going back from entertainment and just that influence. Let's step back a little bit. You've got these chapters, and every chapter has sort of a stumble that our society took on the way to trying to get utopia. And one of them, of course, is in education. It's a huge one. And if you're going to attack the foundations, you've got to start with the youth. That started before the 60s, at the turn of the century, really, with John Dewey. And the idea was to get rid of the spiritual influences on these kids' lives. It wasn't part of his thinking. And to de-emphasize learning and replace it with attitudes. And they're still doing this, aren't they?
They are indeed. And I'm really glad that, Penn, as we open up this second part of our conversation, that we're beginning with the rising generation of young Americans. Because, having lived and worked in Washington now for, going on 4 decades, but as one of us, one thing I have learned is that progressives have a plan for getting the rising generation. Whoever wants this generation is going to get them, it seems to me. And I often say to myself, are Christians and conservatives, what is our plan, to help get the rising generation? But progressives are far ahead of us on this because they've been thinking about this systematically for such a very long time. And one of the absolute goals of the 1960s was to capture the youth. In our first half an hour of discussion, Penna, you were discussing your growing up years in California. On the other coast, of course, there was the Woodstock generation. And I write in Stumbling Toward Utopia how what was happening at Woodstock, sex, drugs, rock and roll, wallowing in the mud, shootings. This was to be the new model for the 1960s and 70s. In fact, what happened at Woodstock, the Woodstock generation, the age of Aquarius, smack, dope, acid, there's a lot going on, and it's all mixed in with neo-Marxist thinking. There's a reason on the cover of Stumbling Toward Utopia where I have a huge student protest that I have the portrait of Che Guevara right in the middle, because the goal of the image makers of the 60s was to wrap all together the rising generation of young Americans, radicalization of education and the campus, and the use of people like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others, as models for young people. And of course, unfortunately, deeply unfortunately, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
They did, but we did see the devastation of that drug culture that you described from Woodstock, which made that just a horrible event. But that's why I don't understand. We really tried to fight that for a while, but it's just coming back, legalizing so many drugs, even marijuana, which is so much stronger than it was back then, and the opioid crisis. And, instead of trying to stop that again and the devastation that it causes, we're actually facilitating it.
Absolutely right. And in fact, there's so much going on every single day in the national headline count that it's difficult to often keep up with the way that progressives, who are the natural inheritors of the utopians of the 60s and 70s, are busy as beavers doing everything they can to destroy Western culture and the idea that we are all made in the image of God. And you touched on one of the most important ones, which is the wide availability of drugs, the celebration of drugs, and now Penna, kind of in the 60s, point two, or should I say point 3 or 4, their newest obsession is suicide and what they call, euthanasia and death with dignity, and always wrapping in the use of drugs, psychedelics, etc., as a gentle way into that good night. And they learned, as George Orwell did, as a man of the left, but who came through, the terrible footprint of Soviet totalitarianism, that the first duty, he said, of an intelligent person is to restate the obvious. And I think he restated the obvious in 1984 in Animal Farm as reminders to 21st century Americans, as an echo in Stumbling Toward Utopia, that we have to get up every single day and we have to confront what people who are motivated by the moral relativism of the 60s and 70s and the nihilism of the 60s and 70s, we have to confront this with the idea of objective truth and the reality that Christianity so beautifully provides to our nation.
That's why we believers have such a role to play. And, it seems even back in the 60s, you saw this big effort by progressives to get rid of all semblance of Christianity in the schools. And there were court cases after court case after court case that in which that happened. I'd love to see some of that coming back. And, we are getting back some religious freedoms. But the schools are still, the public schools are really still hotbeds of progressivism. And you see it now because parents are pushed out of many decisions, even affecting the actual bodies of their own children who think they are the opposite gender.
Again, I'm just so pleased that you raised these crucial issues. I was in a debate when Stumbling Toward Utopia just came out, when it was brand new, just in late September. I was in a debate, and my interlocutor was talking about, kind of a celebration of the 1960s. She profoundly disagrees with the narrative of what you and I are describing. And she delineated what she felt was the principal target or targets of the 1960s. And I absorbed, I pray with civility, what she was saying. But the thing that I said to her, Penna, is the thing that I respond to you, which is that I believe that the number one target of the 1960s was the natural nuclear family. The natural nuclear family as the absolute foundation of American society and culture and an ordered, confident, strong nation. And of course, you cannot understand the goodness of marriage, family, and parenting without understanding the incredible importance of the Judeo-Christian culture and its absolute foundational impact on the founding of our great country. And it remains the reason that we are one of the, if not the most powerful nations in world history. You cannot understand, our power as a nation apart from the fact that we are a religious republic, despite what the 60s wanted for the future of our nation.
You also have a chapter, and I think this and the family stumble chapter and the fiscal stumble chapter dovetail in many ways, because the actual policies of the 1960s and President Johnson's Great Society programs, a war on poverty, an obvious attempt for utopia here to solve problems that we had, but they actually made them worse, and they also harmed the family, didn't they?
They absolutely did. And in fact, I spend at length time on the Great Society, which is perhaps the nadir and the lowest moment in public policy of the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson, who becomes president after the murder of John Kennedy, becomes president then in his own right, elected against Barry Goldwater in 1964. Unlike John Kennedy, a really radical leftist. And he begins launching the Great Society. He launches it at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And Penna, you can hardly believe the promises that gargantuan government is going to resolve. I had to go back and read most of the major speeches of LBJ. I mean, the government was going to solve poverty. It was going to solve the problems of our inner cities. It was going to solve racial relations. It was going to take over education and make education excellent. It goes on and on, and we all know that what government incentivizes, it makes worse.
Well, other than race, I think it has made everything worse. And, we're going to talk about some of the ways in which that has happened. After the break, Tim Goeglein is my guest. Stay with us for the final segment of this interview.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As we look at the institution of marriage today and the lower marriage rates, fewer of the poor are marrying. And that, I believe, the Great Society programs were the genesis of this. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was saying, we went into the break, I think that very often what government incentivizes, it gets more of. And Penna, because government often incentivizes bad things, it gets bad outcomes. I show in the book that in 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that it was a crisis that 25% of all Black Americans were born out of wedlock. That number today in America is between 70 and 75%. 53% of all of all Hispanic Americans are born out of wedlock, and above 30% of native-born whites are born out of wedlock. In fact, the majority of babies, Penna, who are born to American women who are 30 years of age and under are born out of wedlock. We have a fatherhood crisis, which in many ways is a direct result of the Great Society. And I show in the book that in 1960, this wasn't very long ago, in 1960, 73% of all young people were living in an American home with a married mother and father. That number by 1980 was down to 53%, and the number by 2015 was barely above 40%. These are really shocking numbers, and it was a rapid decline. And you can look at the 1960s and the way that we've been talking about it in this great conversation, and you can look at the way that progressives have overtaken the public policy process, especially with regard to marriage, family, parenting, human life, religious liberty, and almost always the outcomes are precisely the opposite of what are good for the overwhelming majority of the American people.
This is all so depressing in a sense. I think what happened to the intact black family is just an absolute travesty. And also the idea that, these welfare programs that were launched back in the 60s in the war on poverty, quote unquote, they didn't cure poverty. They destroyed the family. And our welfare programs have simply grown astronomically, haven't they?
Mm-hmm. They have, and I must say, and I want to be very clear about this, I am, despite what we've been talking about, I am an inveterate, bottomless optimist about America's future. I really am. I believe that the restoration of the American dream is ahead of us, because I think there are millions of people, many of whom have not traditionally been conservatives or Republicans, but I think there are millions of people who have been so terribly impacted by these things, and they are overwhelmingly rethinking, which is a great thing. And I believe that American restoration might very well be ahead of us.
Tim, I agree with you. It doesn't sound like I'm an optimist today, but we've had this election, this big shift, and as you said, different people now are actually waking up to things that we should be doing and that we can do. And I think that maybe you could give some words of encouragement, and we should probably do another interview on policy and what we can do. But that Christians, conservative believers, we have a lot more people now in our tribe, in a sense, for elections. But there's still the thinkers, the people that understand how God works and how conservative values work, how the economy works. And so I think we're going to have to, rather than sit back and say, we won the election, we're going to need to be involved, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I know that we share in common that you and I would rather, strike a match than curse the darkness. And I feel very strongly that of a sudden, the whole trans debate, whether people are Democrats or Republicans, liberals, conservatives, of a sudden, the overwhelming majority of the American people do not want boys playing in girls' sports, and they don't want men playing in women's sports. Of a sudden, we have large numbers of average Americans who are running for school boards, winning, and getting involved in major debates in the refashioning of the curriculum of schools, school choice, charter schools. Penna, here in Washington, where our public schools were among the worst in the nation, more than 40% of all public school children in Washington, D.C. are now in a charter school, which is really remarkable. And so I think there are all kinds of measurable, very positive outcomes in our nation. Almost 4 million young people are now being homeschooled. I think there is a lot of really good news, both in public policy and in culture. And I think even better days are ahead of us.
You know, we mentioned that Woodrow Wilson and his effect on the courts, and then the whole public education system where parents are sort of squeezed out, and they've been, I think during COVID, a lot of parents realized what was going on in their children's schools, and it's been a shift in their involvement and, fighting back. I hope that it's not something that's just temporary. I hope this is a permanent shift, because I don't think we'll ever go back to being able to completely trust the public schools.
Yes, I'll tell you one thing I have learned in Washington in all of my time here, 10 years in the Senate, nearly 8 at the White House, and 16 here at Focus on the Family. And that is, Penna, I have learned that by and large in Washington, there are no permanent defeats and there are no permanent victories. I've learned that we have to work together. Multiplication and addition always beats out subtraction and division. And I believe that expanding our coalition, identifying where people who may not agree with us on a host of things, but who do agree with us on other things, identifying them and working together for the common good is the seedbed of social renewal. And I think it's also the seedbed of culture and civilization. I call it the one nation principle, and I go back to the great Benjamin Franklin. He said there's no freedom without order and no order without virtue. And I think the degree to which moral excellence helps to feed into the elongation of liberty and freedom, that's what we want in the public square. And I think there are millions of people, Penna, who are now with us.
I think you're right. I'm grateful for you as an encourager of some of these trends. You have said in your book, while good people are sleeping, some of these things happened. They're waking up, and it's a time to, I think, take advantage of that. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining me today. I forgot how fun it is to talk to you, and we'll have to do it again soon.
What a blessing and joy. Thank you so much, Penna, and I hope people will enjoy the book.
Yes, it's Stumbling Toward Utopia by Tim Goeglein. And for some of you who are watching online, here's the book. See, it's not that thick, but it is full of wisdom. Maybe a good Christmas present for a friend who would be interested in this. I'm grateful to Tim Goeglein for joining me. Mike Farris is going to join me, and he's joining me in his capacity as counsel for the National Religious Broadcasters. We're going to talk about, it's kind of funny, we're going to talk about the Johnson Amendment, because some bad things happened during the Johnson administration. One of them was the Great Society. That was pretty bad. Another one was the Johnson Amendment, which curtails the ability of pastors and nonprofit organizations to speak about candidates. And especially, you can talk about issues, but you can't connect the issues with the candidates, and that's not helpful to some people. So Mike Farris is going to talk about the fight against that, the challenge in courts, and we'll do that after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
going through the stations and caught Kirby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kirby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My guest this segment, for a couple of segments, is Mike Farris. He joins us often on Point of View on various issues, and I'm grateful I get to be the one interviewing him today. For over 40 years, Mike Farris has practiced constitutional appellate litigation, and he specializes in religious freedom and parental rights. He's argued before the appellate courts of 13 states, 8 federal circuit courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court of the United States. And most of you know he was president and founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I don't think I would have homeschooled in those early years without that. And he also founded Patrick Henry College, and he was president and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom. Now he's in semi-retirement, he says, although I'm not sure I believe it. And he serves as general counsel to the National Religious Broadcasters. And Mike, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Penna. It's great to be with you again.
It's good to have you, and your effort on behalf of repealing the Johnson Amendment and challenging it in courts I think it's been waited for. It's been anticipated for a long time. People are glad you're doing this. I've posted at pointofview.net the press release from NRB, National Religious Broadcasters, talking about this challenge. And tell us, first of all, what is the Johnson Amendment and why do we want to get rid of it?
In 1954, Lyndon Johnson, then a U.S. Senator, took aim at a couple of nonprofit organizations that were critical of him in his service as a U.S. Senator. And in fairness, they were trying to defeat him, which was perfectly lawful activity for them at the time. And he decided to make it unlawful for nonprofit organizations to support or endorse or oppose candidates. And so he got an amendment put into the Internal Revenue Code that put as an additional requirement for nonprofit organizations that they could not support, oppose, or even speak out on candidates for public office, either for or against. And it passed basically without debate, without hearings. And then about a week later, Lyndon Johnson got a Protestant pastor in Texas to send out thousands of endorsement letters to Protestant churches because his primary opponent was a Catholic and saying we needed to elect a good, quote-unquote, Christian man, Lyndon Johnson. So his campaign violated his own amendment within a week or so of its passage.
Well, that's continued. I think you can get away with it if you're on the left, but on the right, you're in trouble if you violate the Johnson Amendment. Or if you don't get in trouble, you're afraid you're going to get in trouble. Would you agree?
Indeed. And the lawsuit that we filed in Tyler, Texas, in the federal court there, goes into meticulous detail about two categories of nonprofits that, on the left-hand side of the aisle, regularly endorse candidates. In fact, the catalyst for this particular approach was a discovery that I made that a number of newspapers were going out of business in the for-profit world, and they were remaking themselves as nonprofits. And this included one of the biggest papers in the country, the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I just asked myself when I heard this, well, I wonder if they still endorse candidates. And I looked it up, and sure enough, in the 13 or so years since the Philadelphia Inquirer had become nonprofit, it regularly endorsed Democrats every single election, every year. There was either a national or a regional or a local race that they endorsed candidates on the Democratic side of the platform. And then looking at hundreds of other nonprofit newspapers, we found many, many examples of these organizations that either directly endorsed candidates or went over the line in what's, the statutory standard is supporting or opposing candidates. And when people say things like in nonprofit newspapers, like, Donald Trump is an egomaniac that should never be elected by anybody, and words to that effect, or worse, that's opposing a candidate. And so even if they don't feel like they've formally endorsed a candidate, those kind of articles in newspapers for nonprofit are supporting or opposing. And we make it very clear in the lawsuit that both these newspapers and Democrat-leading churches that do the same thing and support Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and so on, that we think they have the constitutional right to do so, but it just shouldn't be one-sided. That everybody, all nonprofits, should have the freedom of speech to say what they want to say about candidates.
I know there are some churches in our country who do a lot to get people involved in the political arena as believers, as Christians, and I applaud that. But most churches don't do that. In fact, they don't do it either because they don't think it's important or because they're afraid. And they can already, even with the Johnson Amendment, go up to a certain line in discussing the issues, but they often just don't do it because they're afraid of violating it, don't you think?
Indeed. The fear of violating the Johnson Amendment is one of the two big fears, and the other sort of related to that, and that is fear of antagonizing potential donors and members of their church. And so a lot of churches put the gloss on it that, well, if we do this, then we can't preach the gospel to people. Well, my experience is just the opposite. I'm a member, in fact, I'm one of the elders at Cornerstone Chapel in Leesburg, Virginia. Gary Hamrick's our pastor. He's becoming more well-known in our country. Mm-hmm. And he openly preaches on these issues, talks strongly about candidates, talks about party platforms. And every year, on Easter and Christmas in particular, hundreds of people accept Christ. I mean, one Easter a couple of years ago, 1,100 decisions for Christ were made in the series of Easter services. We'll have, I think, 10 Christmas Eve services this year, and I would anticipate someplace between 500 and 700 people getting saved. And the churches that I know where people are getting saved in dramatic numbers also take a real strong stand on the issues. And so, in fact, if you don't take a stand against sin, it's hard to get people saved. And so, in fact, a lot of the fear of people standing up against abortion or gay marriage or these other kinds of things is they don't like talking about sin. And if you don't like talking about sin, I don't know how you preach the gospel.
We've got some hope in this country, and in the next segment, I'm going to continue to discuss that hope, and perhaps if NRB and Mike Farris are successful in striking the Johnson Amendment. I mean, it would just be great if that happened. I want to know the chances of them being successful, and I'm going to ask Mike about that, and also, what we Christians then could do differently. How we can encourage our own pastor churches and other nonprofits. I mean, even Point of View. Sometimes we have to obey those strictures of that evil Johnson Amendment. We hope we get rid of it. We're going to talk more about this right after this message.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, the carol, O Come, Emmanuel, is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, Praise the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us. In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter. Mike Farris is my guest, and I'm so grateful that we are able to talk about the Johnson Amendment. I have posted at pointofview.net the press release from National Religious Broadcasters Association, where Mike Farris is general counsel, and one quote from it says, Our intent is to vindicate the right of every church and religious nonprofit to express what their faith teaches on every issue, including political matters, as is their right and their duty. That sounds very reasonable, but it is prevented by the Johnson Amendment, and so NRB is challenging it, along with, I guess, some other churches. So, Mike, can you tell us about this challenge?
Sure. We have 4 plaintiffs in the case. NRB Intercessors for America, which is a prayer-based ministry that also has put out a voting guide for many years, and then 2 churches, both in the greater Tyler area where the lawsuit is being prosecuted. And so we did not seek a preliminary injunction in the case, which is what you do oftentimes in free speech-related cases, for 2 reasons. One, we didn't want anybody to think that we were just trying to do a gimmick for the 2024 election. And secondly, we want to be able to take discovery from the IRS to get into their files and show their bias in the way that they have interpreted and applied the Johnson Amendment over the years.
So where does it stand?
Well, we're expecting a motion from the Internal Revenue Service to dismiss. The typical thing for the government to do in constitutional challenges is move to dismiss at the beginning. And their motion is due December 23rd. So we'll get it any day now, and then I'll be responding to that. probably be about a 60-day window for the response. And one thing that will be important for that is that the Biden administration will no longer be in charge of the case once my response has been filed. And so the final step of the motion to dismiss will be the government's reply brief, and we may see some difference in approach by the Biden administration's compared to from the Trump administration rather than the Biden administration. So I expect that we'll be interested to see what the Trump administration wants to do. They could come in and concede that the thing is unconstitutional, and that would be great. But we're not going to do anything other than a full constitutional victory. If there was some settlement that was offered that would be halfway, we're not interested. We want the law to be declared unconstitutional once and for all. Now, we should point out that there are three things that the 501c3 requires. One is you can't lobby more than a little bit. In reality, you don't need to lobby more than a little bit for the nonprofit. So that part is inconsequential. The second part is you can't give money directly to candidates, and we don't want to do that. Regular corporations won free speech rights in the Citizens United case, but they can't give money directly to the candidate, and we don't want to do that either. And frankly, it'd be candidates pestering you to death if you could do that. The third thing is you can't speak out about candidates. You can't say what you want for or against them. That's the part that we're challenging. So it's just exactly like Citizens United in that sense, only that was done for for-profits and 501c4 organizations. Although one of the reasons that we feel very, very good about our chances of winning is that the Supreme Court gave 3 examples of nonprofits that might want to speak out about political candidates. And all 3 were 501c3 organizations. It was the National Rifle Association and Planned Parenthood, and I believe the third was the Sierra Club. Now, they have C4 affiliates, but the exact group that they cited in each case was the C3 central organization. So we have strong belief that the principles of Citizens United, which say that your corporate structure can't be the basis for you losing your freedom of speech. And that's the case. And we've also pointed out that other nonprofit tax-exempt organizations that are allowed to, the business expenses can be deductible, or in some cases, their donations can be deductible. They get to speak out on a candidate, but just 501c3s, which are dominated by religious organizations, cannot. And so the inequality of all this, we believe, is a big basis for, hope that we will prevail in the end.
When you said that you think that the government might move to dismiss this, what would be the basis of that?
Well, they're going to dismiss it principally, I'm sure, on the Anti-Injunction Act. And that law says you can't sue the IRS over tax liabilities before the tax has been come due and paid. And so that's the reason that people have not filed an affirmative case. But I found, I believe, basically a workaround that, because there are 3 exceptions. One is that if you haven't got a current tax liability and you're suing about an underlying principle, then the act doesn't apply. And in this case, what that means is all of my 4 clients have talked about issues, but they've never endorsed candidates. And so if they'd endorsed candidates, that their tax liability would be on the line, and the Anti-Injunction Act would apply. But since none of them have, they've self-censored, and self-censorship is a ground for First Amendment standing, so that we can go into court and challenge the case. But there's no tax liability owing here, and so the IRS can't say that we're trying to litigate tax liability, because that's just not the case. The other exception is if the IRS is doing this in interpreting the law in a discriminatory manner, favoring Democrats over Republican-leaning organizations, and we've got strong evidence of that, or if it's in a crazy quilt kind of manner, in an arbitrary and capricious or irrational manner. So we believe that all 3 of those exceptions apply here, that their discrimination sometimes is purposeful, sometimes is just crazy quilt, but there's no rhyme to reason. Nobody knows. In fact, the IRS is own test for this is facts and circumstances. The totality of facts and circumstances, then we'll tell you if you've gone over the line of the Johnson Amendment. Well, that by definition is an arbitrary and capricious standard. So that's going to be the principal battle, is the Anti-Injunction Act, and we think that we've got really good arguments against it, and they may raise the issue of standing, whether the case is the people have a particular stake in the outcome, but I don't think there's going to be an issue in that issue. I think we'll prevail on that, but that's what we anticipate would be those two grounds, and we're ready for it. We put things about those issues into the complaint, getting the court a chance to think about that before they hear from the IRS.
Well, one more question, Mike, before I let you go, and thank you so much for joining me. What, if you're successful, what can we do with this development that we actually can be much more bold, either from the pulpit or any nonprofit that's communicating their stance on elections? So what can we do going forward?
Well, the reality is that born-again Christians, like many others in society, don't vote with the kind of consistency that would be able to maximize our influence. And so if the people that just stay home, they don't look about 35 to 40% of professing born-again Christians just don't show up at the polls. Well, if their pastor was regularly teaching them that God, has something to say about this, starting with Proverbs 3:6, in all thy ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. And if you have a right, for him who knows to do right and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And so you get a little teaching on this. I think this just simply increasing the number of Christians voting. If we got out of the 35 to 40% absentee rate and we're more like 85, 90% voting, this country would be a different place.
I think you're right.
And so that's the big hope for, is that people would just simply vote. And if they vote according to their convictions and according to their beliefs, then our country is being misrepresented because people who have the right to ask for better representation are improperly silent. And they're silent because the pulpits are silent. If we get the pulpits out of the silent mode, the people will respond appropriately.
Mike, thank you. And thank you so much for your effort. And we will get an update from you. And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Penna.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to mention here before the end of the segment that we're heading into Christmas and the end of the year. And we really ask that you would think about your giving decisions and that you would include point of view in that. We have a $125,000 year-end grant, sort of a matching grant. So you might want to take advantage of that and think about making a year-end donation to Point of View. It would be greatly appreciated, and we could use it going into the new year with so much on our plate. So stick with us for the final couple segments of Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Penna Dexter.
I'm grateful to my two guests that have joined me on the program today, Tim Goeglein and his book, Stumbling Toward Utopia, and also Mike Farris. And both of them, they both have a lot to say about education. We didn't talk so much with that with Mike Farris today, but he's certainly a pioneer in homeschooling and higher education with his founding of the Patrick Henry College. And so I just want to get back to that issue a little bit here in these final couple of segments because Tim Goeglein mentioned in education going back into the early turn of the century in America. And we said these words. We said, if you're going to attack America's foundations, start with the youth. And it really started at the turn of the century with John Dewey, who in 1904 wrote about how public education would bring about a new social order. That's what he was after. And he was very influential for decades in education. Spirituality was not part of it, although it was part of education in America before that time and up into the turn of the century. But in 1933, so he started in 1904 writing about changing the youth and changing the society through public education. But way up in 1933, he made a speech about de-emphasizing learning and replacing it with attitudes, and they are still doing this. And I think, one of the ways they had to do this, of course, was to push parents out of the way because parents are going to object to having the attitudes of their children changed. And there were a couple of Supreme Courts that doubled down on this. In 1962, there was a case which said, which basically prohibited teachers from being able to open class with prayer, which had been done before. And then in 1963, a case that prohibited the Lord's Prayer from being required in schools. These had devastating effects, of course, on our public schools and on the culture at large. But Dewey's influence was powerful. There was a Soviet influence on education, sort of the idea of collectivization, lots of new learning theories taught. Different ways of teaching things like math and reading. I remember that from my early years, my mom just complaining about the way they're teaching reading. And it was, not phonetically. It was done through trying to memorize words. And you have to memorize some words, but to teach phonetically is much simpler. And they weren't about academics. They were about changing attitudes and values. And we're seeing that today. We're seeing the teaching of, what a family is back in the 90s and the early 2000s, the definition of a family changing to be any group of people living together. And then you had the whole push for same-sex marriage, which they attained completely in America through the Obergefell decision, although we as believers still in our own churches don't define marriage as between two members of the same sex. But that's the way now states have to operate with regard to marriage. So that's another change in the definition of the family. And then now there's this teaching of gender identity, and that you can identify yourself whichever sex you want to identify yourself as, and you must be treated that way. And that's what we're dealing with now. And parents who object to this, sometimes they're talked out of it. They're talked into letting their kids have surgeries. But other times, they are simply not told. They are simply child is uprooted from the home by maybe the separated spouse and taken somewhere else and allowed to go into, a different gender. There's all kinds of things happening like that, this today, undermining the rights of parents. And this started back with Dewey and his attempt to undermine the role of spirituality, the family, and our traditional values. So that's what we're seeing. And COVID, as Tim and I said, woke many parents up to this. And we're seeing some groups now and parents fighting back. And, I'm thinking of groups like Parents Defending Education, Moms for Liberty. Some of these groups are having great success. They're getting on school boards and they're getting parents active. So it's great. But I did see a piece that kind of went right. It was just another story that you can see just the effects of these trends. And it was actually today, Rod Dreher, he posted the story. It's out of the Daily Mail. He says, the Daily Mail is where Americans sometimes have to go to find out what's really happening in our country. This story out of the Daily Mail is something that happened in Florida. And it was a Florida mother. She says her 13-year-old daughter was placed on a path toward medically transitioning. She received encouragement from teachers at her school, but none of this her parents didn't know and did not consent to this. The mother is January Littlejohn. She's 47 years old, and she says she was both shocked and heartbroken when teachers at her daughter's school allegedly met in private with her teen daughter to affirm her belief that she was transgender, again, all without parental consent. January Littlejohn, it's quite a name, has now become a vocal critic of policies that she says undermined her family in what is a dramatic tale of gender identity and parental rights. She actually spoke outside the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago when the Tennessee case was heard in the Supreme Court about gender identity and giving the transition surgeries and affirming gender, quote unquote, gender affirming care, puberty blockers and hormones to minors. On that case, we await the decision. Probably will come down next summer. But January Littlejohn went to the court, and a lot of people were speaking outside the court, and she spoke, addressing protesters outside the court. Littlejohn recounted her daughter's experience of gender dysphoria and the actions of school officials she claimed pushed her child toward a transgender identity. I was outraged, she said, that 3 adults had sat alone with my child and agreed to this without my consent. I mean, can you imagine? Can you just imagine how it would be if this happened with your child? She said that it felt like we were in the Twilight Zone. The situation all began in 2019 when Littlejohn's daughter, then 12, began identifying with a new friend group that embraced various gender identities. She said her daughter was quirky and unique and it suffered from low self-esteem, so she didn't really worry about this group of friends too much at that point. But she grew alarmed as the group's obsession with gender intensified. Because, of course, changing your gender tends to be the solution offered now by the left and by many psychologists and other medical personnel for the problems that plague young people. That's supposed to be the answer, changing your gender. And I hope we get over this moment in history where that's the case, but that's where we are right now. By 13, Mrs. Littlejohn's daughter was discussing medical interventions such as puberty blockers and top surgery, which means having your breasts removed, with a casualness that shocked her parents. Unbeknownst to them, the school staff had already placed their daughter on a gender support plan, which included discussions about which restrooms and locker rooms she would use, pronouns, and rooming arrangements on field trips. When the next school year began, Mrs. Littlejohn, who is a licensed mental health counselor, but not one of those ones that recommends gender transition, she knew her child wanted to start using a different name, and she warned the school about what they might have to deal with. She told the school that the family had made the decision not to use her new name, but instead to seek counseling. That's what a responsible parent would do in this case. Yet the school did not back Littlejohn's wishes. So here you go. You've got parents that want to do the right thing, but the school is going to fight the parents. They didn't back it. They set up its own gender plan for the daughter, and they refused to share the details of it. This is, to me, this is criminal. We ought to have lots of lawsuits going on about this, and I hope we do. coming up in the next administration. And I hope they're successful. These parents should sue the school system, sue them into the ground, let there be nothing left but rubble. This is Rod Dreher. This is unspeakably horrific. How can anybody trust the institution after something like this? And that's very true. I don't know how we can trust schools with our children, schools that have, in many cases, taken these children, counseled them to transition, and even taken steps toward getting them to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just one story of many, but I wanted to tell it because it's kind of the fruit of what began back in the 60s. Stay with us. We've got more of Point of View.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I have posted a couple of articles at pointofview.net, and one of them has to do with, it's called, unsurprisingly, Democrats call on Biden to break the law before leaving office. It's from the Daily Signal. And it has to do with the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was actually defeated, but these Democrats and certain supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment want to deem it as part of the U.S. Constitution anyway. And the Equal Rights Amendment prohibits, it guarantees legal equality between men and women, and but it's dangerous because it does so in ways that, number one, promote abortion, because if men don't have to have babies, women don't either. So in a lot of ways, it downgrades the efforts of the pro-life movement. It also would put women in combat with men because if men have to fight, women do. And there's so many efforts to do these things anyway that this just kind of plays right along with the left's agenda. It's just something that that was defeated, that states did not ratify back in the 70s. I mean, some states did ratify it, but there weren't enough states to ratify it back in the 70s. And what happens with these constitutional amendments is you can have two parts to it. The first part of a constitutional amendment is a clause that includes rules for how the states must consider ratification. So whether they must use their legislature or whether they might use a convention to ratify a constitutional amendment, if there's a deadline that Congress chooses to oppose. And then the second part of the resolution would be the actual text of the amendment being proposed. But Congress takes one vote on the entire resolution, and that's what happened. Congress voted on it, and then the states had to ratify it. Well, the states ratified 27 of the 33 amendments that Congress has proposed. Some of them had ratification deadlines, some did not, but the ERA did. It had a deadline. And that deadline passed, and it didn't get ratified by enough states to become part of the Constitution. But now, this effort has popped up many times since the 70s, and it's popping up again. And what happened was there was an effort to extend the deadline. They extended it for a while, but they still didn't get the states that they needed to pass the ERA. So now they're trying to do that again. 30 states ratified the ERA in 1972 in the first year. Then only 5 more did so by the March 1979 deadline. They had 7 years to do it. And then 5 of those ratifying states rescinded their approval. Congress passed a controversial resolution adding 39 months to the deadline, but no additional states got on board. So, it's dead. The ERA is dead, but not according to some people that are out there trying to revive it somehow. 3 states decided that they were going to ratify it. Nevada decided in 2018, even though it was already dead. Illinois in 2019 and Virginia in 2020. They passed resolutions purporting to ratify the amendment. It's a really non-existent amendment, but they did it anyway. They claimed that because they had enough states now and this is crazy. But they said that now the ERA was part of the Constitution. Well, it isn't. A federal judge back in 1982, during one of these efforts to ratify it, a federal judge ruled that it was no longer pending before the states and could not be ratified. But people are not accepting that opinion, of course. And so the latest opinion in 2020 concluded that because the 1972 ratification of the ERA deadline expired, it is no longer pending before the states. I mean, how many times do you need to affirm that the ERA is dead? But Senate Democrats wrote a letter to Joe Biden. They want him to order the archivist to do what his own Justice Department argues the archivist has no obligation to do. And their letter notes that Article 5 does not impose a time limit for ratification of a proposed amendment, but they never mention these court cases that I just mentioned. If this is complicated and you want to read about it, it's at pointofview.net. The letter to Biden skips the part where the 27th Amendment was pending indefinitely because it had no ratification deadline. So they use that as their example. The 27th Amendment was ratified, but they never had a deadline in that one. The ERA did have a deadline. Its deadline passed with insufficient state support. So you might hear news. You might see that the ERA is not dead and we could still have an ERA. And Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York said she was the ERA's longtime primary House sponsor. She insisted back then that the ERA had nothing to do with abortion. But now they're talking about the ERA will it will remove the abortion restrictions that we've got. It will bring us back to full-on abortion rights. It's the most effective means at our disposal to make sure that you have the right to abort your child. And since abortion is so popular among Democrats, I guess right now, they're using abortion instead of denying that the ERA would bring abortion. They're now using it as a way to get it out there again and somehow deemed part of the U.S. Constitution. So it's bizarre, and this is what the the Daily Signal article says. The Senate Democrats' demand is especially bizarre because even the Biden Justice Department has already rejected it in its brief defending the archivist against the states suing for the very same thing Senate Democrats want. The DOJ argued that the states have not identified any relevant legal authority requiring that amendment, the ERA, to be certified. Justice Scalia described this whole effort. He said it was discredited. The Supreme Court precedent was discredited. And he said that the ERA is like some ghoul in a late-night horror movie that repeatedly sits up in its grave and shuffles abroad after being repeatedly killed and buried. So that's the effort to get the ERA in some strange way of just deeming it as part of the Constitution. If you read about it, you'll know just to please ignore it and oppose it. I've also posted Ann Coulter's town hall article, Kill Obamacare, Not CEOs. And, of course, it has to do with the killing of a United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. And it's really funny and good. I can't go over it because we don't have the time. But I would commend that to you. I also want to commend to you Point of View as one of the subjects of your year-end giving. We know that we exist because of the generosity of our listeners, and we're so grateful for that. And we want to encourage you to think at this year-end about including Point of View in your year-end giving. And to encourage you, we actually have a $125,000 matching grant on the table. So if you give, your grant will be matched up to $125,000. And of course, as you know, we take a lot of care to take good care of the funds that people so generously give us to do the most with that money. To give you the information that you need to really make a difference in our country. So we'd be very grateful if you would include us in your year-end giving. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you tomorrow for more of Point of View.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
going through the stations and caught Kirby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate point of view. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have point of view? And come on, guys, give something to point of view to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kirby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.